Kishore, thank you so much for joining us here in Barcelona. I know that you've been looking in detail about what you see as being the key focus areas for the regulators at the moment in relation to the FRTB regime. What would you say about that at this point?
First of all, thank you for the opportunity. It's my pleasure. So from a regulator standpoint, I would say there are sort of three aspects that they're currently focusing on, and that's almost like a three-pronged approach that the regulators wish to take in enforcing the FRTB regime. And if you look at the US and put that in context, so the first component of that approach is to put emphasis on the post-NPR phase, the notice of proposed rulemaking. The second component of that approach would be the emphasis on the post-final rule phase, when the final rules get published. And the last component of that would be the post-go-live phase. Now, what the regulator intends to do, based on my own interactions with multiple regulators, is in the post-NPR phase, they're essentially kind of focusing on two elements. One is to try and kind of do an examination of all the banks' approach to FRTB. And the second component is to conduct a hypothetical portfolio review. So when it comes to the examination, the regulator is essentially looking for carrying out a detailed review of all the desk structures as it applies to both the standardized approach and the internal model approach. And in particular, they want to review all the data sources for various internal risk systems as part of this exercise. What's very interesting is I don't expect the regulator during the post-NPR phase to impose any MRAs during this phase, because this is just a discovery phase as it reaches out to the industry. And the integral component to this, the post-NPR phase, is also conducting a hypothetical portfolio review where it's almost similar to what the benchmarking exercise was carried out by ISDA, where they kind of involved more than about 70 different banks over the last 3 years and about 20 regulators. Similarly, they've identified a hypothetical portfolio and they're trying to obtain feedback from the industry. So that's the focus area within the post-NPR phase. And once they collate all this feedback, then they will kind of loop that back into their draft rules and then come out with the final rules as it gets published. So that's what I anticipate from the US Fed. And when that happens, this is when they will try and make sure all the proposed changes in the NPR, the notice of proposed rulemaking, will be implemented during the post-final rule phase. And here, the regulators will have a pointed focus on examining all the models of the banks, be it for the SA or the IMA. And they will also try and come out with a checklist that will be applicable for the banks when they go for model approval submissions. So these are some of the focus areas. And the last is the go-live phase, which is where during this period they will focus on following each and every aspect in the previous two phases. And then from here on, I would expect, there'll be very, very sort of tight runway where both the Fed and the banks will have to get their act up and then ensure that they actually are subject to a quarterly review basis going forward. So that's what I imagine will happen. So
you started to touch on it there, but what will the bank's approach need to be? What do they need to be doing now with all of that in mind?
Absolutely. So if you look at, if I can indulge myself and take a step back in the Basel IV regime, if you look at Basel 1, 2, 2.5 or 3, so to speak, the entire regime focused on the numerator side of the equation, which talks about what are the quality of assets, what kind of capital ratios, what kind of haircuts are applicable, among other things. But if you look at Basel IV, which is where the FRTB comes into play, is the entire equation is flipped upside down, and the focus is on the denominator side of the equation, which is how do you determine a risk-weighted asset and quantify the required capital for credit, market, and ops risk. So as far as the banks are concerned, now the focus would be to try and just address the three takeaways from the FRTB that the regulators have come out with, at the risk of oversimplifying. The one being, how do I make sure I have a clear line in the sand between the trading and the banking book activities? That's the number one focus area for the banks now. The second focus area would be to try and determine what candidates or the trading desk candidates would be subjected to internal model approvals. So to begin with, I would suggest that the bank try and identify a potential set of candidates that has a mix of both business and asset class complexity, so that they can kind of do sort of proof of concept of the model approvals. And the third focus area I would say for the bank's perspective is, now if you look at how the rules are being enforced across the globe on either sides of Atlantic and Pacific, and particularly Asia, if you look at, when I say Asia, it's not United States of Asia. And by that what I mean is you're dealing with multiple regulators. So the challenge now for the banks would be to try and find that least common denominator between all the regulatory timelines. And then more importantly, go with certain working assumptions. That's let me define my trading banking book. Let me start going full force implementing with the standardized approach, because that has to be done anyway, because of the output flow. So that would be my sort of,
And you talked there about it not being the United States of Asia and the number of regulators. Does there need to be a sort of collaborative approach between the banks and the regulators now? And is that relationship evolving, and is that improving?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, if you look at the voice from the industry, they expect a greater degree of harmonization of all the rulemaking process. And if you look back into all the regulatory rulemaking process, right from, let's say, July 2010, from when Dodd-Frank came into existence, so clearly we have seen divergent approaches, because ultimately the outcome that they want to reach is the same, but each regulator will take a different path, because they have to address the region-specific market nuances. And so as a result of that, there will be divergent paths. So the industry will have to be able to adapt to this, divergent timelines, which I'm sure they'll be able to do it. So,
Kishore, great to hear your insights. Thank you so much for joining us. Good to
Thank you very much.